before the pharaohs stacked a single limestone block at Giza. A confederation of clans in southeastern Australia was constructing a settlement of 146 stone dwellings, arranged along a dormant volcano's edge, complete with stone-lined channels that held eels for year-round harvest. The volume of basalt moved to build the Bujbim complex exceeds 50,000 cubic meters, a feat of organized labor that required hundreds of people coordinating across generations. Yet the word civilization is almost never applied to it because the people who built it did not smelt metal or write in clay. The accepted global narrative insists that agriculture, permanent architecture, and social stratification emerged in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago and only reached Australia with British colonization in 1788. The quantified catalyst is the radiocarbon dating of charcoal from hearths beneath the stone foundations, which returned ages of 6,600 years before present, making Bujbim one of the oldest known stone villages on Earth, older than the Great Pyramid, older than Stonehenge, and contemporaneous with the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. The logical cascade that follows is devastating to the standard history of human progress. If Aboriginal Australians engineered an aquaculture system that manipulated water flows, stone traps, and migratory fish cycles 6 millennia ago, then the definition of civilization as a Eurasian invention is a colonial artifact, not an empirical truth. The material proof was uncovered by the Gunditch, mirroring traditional owners and archaeologists from Flinders University, who mapped the channels using ground-penetrating radar and demonstrated that the eel traps were gravity-fed. Weirs designed to capture migrating short-finned eels at specific seasonal flows, a hydrological engineering principle that requires precise knowledge of local topography and fish ethology. The peer-reviewed evidence was published in the journal Australian Archaeology in 2019, and the site now holds UNESCO World Heritage status. But the global imagination still resists calling it a civilization because it lacks a written script and monumental temples. The existential tremor here is that an entire continent's deep history of social complexity has been written out of the human story, not because the evidence was absent, but because the criteria for recognition were defined in a way that excluded it. That same blindness extends beneath the rainforest canopy of northern Queensland, where a ghostly forest of stinging trees and poisonous nuts was deliberately engineered into a food bowl by a civilization most Australians have never heard of. The wet tropics of Queensland hide the fingerprints of the gerbil and related rainforest people who reshaped an entire ecosystem across 32,000 square kilometers without clearing a single hectare. The declaration of scale is this: genetic analysis of the toxic black bean, Castanospermum australe, reveals that the trees growing in clusters near ancient campsites are not wild, but clonal lineages selected for lower toxicity over at least 5,000 years, a process of domestication that occurred entirely within a forest canopy, leaving no open fields to be recognized as farms. The status quo of anthropology long maintained that Aboriginal people were exclusively hunter-gatherers who manipulated their environment only through firestick farming, never through deliberate plant selection or cultivation. The quantified catalyst came from a 2020 study led by Gary Turpin, an ethnobotanist with the Australian Tropical Herbarium, who documented 31 species of rainforest plants that showed genetic signatures of intentional propagation, including the yellow walnut, the Davidson's plum, and the cycad lepidizamia, whose kernels require an elaborate multi-day leaching process to remove neurotoxins before they can be ground into flour. The logical cascade reveals that the rainforest was not a pristine wilderness, but a managed garden where every tree held a purpose, where the forest structure itself was a record of 10,000 years of selective weeding, transplanting, and burning at precise intervals to maintain open understories for hunting. The material proof is written in the soil charcoal layers from Lake Uramu, which show that fire frequency increased dramatically around 8,000 years ago and remained regular until European arrival, a pattern consistent with controlled cool burns that promoted edible plant regrowth without destroying the canopy. The research was published in quaternary science reviews, and the genetic markers of domestication were confirmed through chloroplast DNA sequencing. Yet textbooks on the history of agriculture routinely omit Oceania, because the model of farming that requires a plow and a grain silo cannot see a forest full of genetically modified trees as a farm. The reflection that festers here is that the boundary between hunter-gatherer and agriculturalist is a line drawn by people who could not imagine that a society might choose to cultivate an entire ecosystem rather than convert it into a monocrop. That civilization, however, stayed rooted to the forest floor. The next one on this countdown sailed out onto the open ocean with a navigation technology that remained unmatched for 50,000 years. At the height of the last ice age, when the oceans were 120 meters lower and the continent of Sahul stretched from New Guinea to Tasmania as a single landmass. A population explosion occurred in the Kimberley region that left behind the densest concentration of rock art on the planet. The declaration of scale is that the Muruja archipelago alone contains over 1 million petroglyphs, a gallery so vast that it would take 2,000 years for one person to see every image. And the earliest carvings date to 40,000 years ago, depicting animals that went extinct at the hands of those same artists. The status quo of archaeology once assumed that complex iconography and spiritual iconography were gradual achievements that tracked the evolution of cognitive modernity, but the Kimberley sequence shows a fully symbolic mind from the very first panel. The quantified catalyst emerged from uranium series dating of calcite crusts over the paintings by a team led by Damien Finch, which placed the oldest known Guion figures at 46,000 years before present, pushing representational art back 10,000 years beyond the European caves. The logical cascade follows the art across time. The oldest layers show extinct megafauna, like the marsupial tapir, pallor chests. Then the next layers show people with dilly bags and boomerangs. Then contact imagery of Indonesian praus with their distinctive tripod masts, demonstrating a continuous record of cultural adaptation and historical documentation that no other civilization on Earth can match in sheer longevity. The modern expeditions by the University of Melbourne's Rock Art Australia partnership have used portable X-ray fluorescence to identify the ochre recipes and have demonstrated that the pigments were deliberately heat-treated to achieve specific hues, a chemical engineering process that is invisible to the naked eye. The published papers sit in Nature Human Behavior, but the global art historical canon still begins its timeline in Europe. The existential impact is that the Kimberley is not just a gallery, but an archive, a non-textual library that recorded ecological change, migration, and philosophy for 46,000 years, and we have only just begun to learn how to read it. That library was not built by an isolated people, because the trade networks that crisscrossed the continent were so extensive that a pearl shell from the Kimberley coast ended up buried in a grave 2,000 kilometers away in the red center. Imagine a single pearl shell pendant, the size of a hand, engraved with a crosshatch design that signifies water and clan identity, found in a grave at Lake Mungo in western New South Wales, 1,500 kilometers from the nearest ocean where such a shell could be harvested. That is, the Runka necklace. And it is not an isolated oddity. Thousands of such shells have been found across the Australian interior, strung into belts and headdresses, traded hand to hand along routes that stretched from the Torres Strait to the Great Australian Bight. The declaration of scale is that the Aboriginal trade network was the longest continuous exchange system in human prehistory, operating for over 30,000 years, linking hundreds of language groups across a continent the size of Europe. The status quo of economic history teaches that long-distance trade required centralized states, currency, and writing. Yet here was a decentralized network that moved ochre, stone axes, shells, and intellectual property, song cycles, across the entire landmass, without a single coin changing hands. The quantified catalyst comes from geochemical sourcing of stone tools. Basalt axes from the Mount William quarry in Victoria have been found in campsites 800 kilometers north, and the unique isotopic signature of the greenstone matches the quarry exactly, proving that the axes were traded through a series of reciprocal exchanges documented in oral histories. The logical cascade is documented by the great gatherings at places like Bunya in Queensland, where every 3 years thousands of people from dozens of language groups would converge when the bunya pines dropped their massive cones, trading not just goods, but marriages, stories, and legal precedents, creating a pan-continental social fabric that functioned as a market without a marketplace. The material proof was compiled by archaeologist Isabel McBride in her seminal 1987 study of the trade routes, which plotted the distribution of ochre, shells, and tools using geospatial data. And more recent DNA analysis of human remains has confirmed that individuals often traveled hundreds of kilometers from their birthplace, matching the oral traditions of long-distance marriage exchanges. The unsettling reflection is that the economic history of humanity is taught as a ladder from barter to coinage to capitalism. But the Australian evidence proves that a stable, complex, and deeply human economic system can exist without any of those things for 40 millennia. If the trade routes were the vascular system of the continent, then the ceremonial grounds where those routes converged were its beating heart. And the largest of those ritual centers is so vast that it can only be appreciated from the air. In the Channel Country of Western Queensland, on a gibber plain, so flat that the horizon bends, a series of stone circles and fire-darkened pits extends for over 1 square kilometer in an arrangement that astronomers have recently recognized as a representation of the Milky Way's dark emu constellation. The site is called Wurdi Yong, and it is not unique. Across Australia, stone arrangements, like the ones at Namaquan in the Northern Territory, aligned to equinoxes and the helical rising of stars in a pattern that demands the existence of a dedicated class of skywatchers who held astronomical knowledge over hundreds of generations. The declaration of scale is that the Wurdi Yong arrangement consists of 90 basalt boulders placed with a precision that marks the setting sun at the solstices, with an accuracy of plus or minus 2 degrees, and some of the stones weigh over a ton, quarried from a location several kilometers away and transported without draft animals. The status quo of archaeoastronomy has long focused on Stonehenge and the Mayan temples as the pinnacle of pre-telescopic astronomy. But the Australian sites predate Stonehenge by several millennia and were built by a nomadic society that carried its observatory in its mind and laid it down in stone only at specific locations. The quantified catalyst was published in the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage in 2020 by Dwayne Hamaker and colleagues, who conducted a systematic survey of over 200 stone arrangement sites and found that at least 35 of them showed statistically significant solar or stellar alignments that could not be explained by random placement. The logical cascade reveals that the Aboriginal celestial knowledge encoded in these stones included the detection of variable stars, the prediction of eclipses, and a detailed map of the Milky Way that functioned as a seasonal calendar for when to harvest emu eggs, a cycle depicted in the dark spaces between the stars themselves. The material proof is cross-validated by the oral traditions of the Wiradjuri people, who still recount the story of the celestial emu rising in the sky at the same time the real emus begin to breed, a natural clock that links the heavens directly to the stomach. The reflection that emerges is that the boundary between astronomy, ecology, and spirituality did not exist for this civilization. The sky was a menu, a storybook, and a legal charter all at once, and the stones were merely the mnemonic anchors for a knowledge system so vast it makes a university curriculum look impoverished. That same impulse to encode cosmic order in the landscape reached its most dramatic expression on the southeastern coast, where a network of grassy plains and carefully burned clearings was not a farm, but something much harder to recognize. When Lieutenant James Cook sailed up the east coast in 1770, he wrote in his journal that the land looked like a gentleman's park, with open grassy woodlands, scattered trees, and pleasant vistas that seemed designed for human enjoyment. What Cook did not realize is that he was looking at a landscape that had been sculpted by 40,000 years of deliberate fire management, a continent-wide agricultural system that produced grain, meat, and fiber without a single fence. The declaration of scale comes from the journal of explorer Thomas Mitchell, who in 1836 described riding for 9 miles through fields of native millet, Panicum decompositum, that were so thick his men gathered over a ton of grain in a single day using their saddlebags. Grain that was being actively harvested, threshed, and stored in large grass seed containers by the local inhabitants he encountered. The status quo of agricultural history insists that the Aboriginal people were passive foragers who simply gathered what nature provided. But Mitchell's own accounts, combined with the diaries of other early explorers like Edward John Eyre, document vast seed harvesting operations, permanent villages near grain belts, and grain stores of up to 1,000 kilograms cached in clay-lined pits. The quantified catalyst emerged from the archaeological excavation of Cuddy Springs in New South Wales, where grinding stones with microscopic seed residues were found in strata dated to 30,000 years before present, making them the oldest known seed grinding tools in the world, predating the domestication of wheat in the Middle East by over 20,000 years. The logical cascade is straightforward. If you have grinding stones, you have flour. If you have flour, you have baking. If you have baking, you have a staple carbohydrate that can sustain sedentary populations. The Narran Lake region in western New South Wales, for example, supported permanent villages of up to 200 people, with well-documented seed harvesting of the native panic grass, which was grown in plots deliberately flooded by earthen channels to extend the growing season, a technique reported by early settlers and confirmed by hydraulic modeling in a 2012 study by the University of Sydney. The material proof is conserved in the residue on those grindstones, now housed in the Australian Museum, and the chemical analysis leaves no doubt that native millet, wattle seed, and bush tomato were processed in bulk. The uncomfortable revelation is that Aboriginal Australia was in the process of domesticating its native grasses when the British arrived, and the continent might have evolved a grain-based civilization as complex as any in the Old World, had the invasion not interrupted a process that was already 30,000 years old. That evolutionary trajectory was not confined to the mainland, because in the Torres Strait, a civilization was already cultivating the seafloor itself. The Torres Strait Islanders, a Melanesian people, built an oceanic civilization across the 150-kilometer stretch between Cape York and Papua New Guinea that challenges the very concept of a hunter-gatherer society. The declaration of scale is the massive stone fish traps and walled garden beds on Mer Island, where the Miriam people constructed over 200 stone-lined agricultural plots, each 1 to 2 meters in diameter, filled with imported coral gravel and composted seaweed to grow yams, sweet potatoes, and bananas in a soil profile they created from scratch on a rocky volcanic island. The status quo in anthropology once described the Torres Strait as a cultural backwater, a mere corridor between two larger links, but carbon dating from the village of Gelim on Badu Island demonstrates continuous occupation for at least 9,000 years, with a material culture that includes outrigger, canoes capable of open ocean voyages, sophisticated harpoons for dugong hunting, and a complex system of totemic clans that controlled access to specific reef resources. The quantified catalyst is the radiocarbon date from a dugong bone temple on Mabwayag Island, where over 100 skulls were arranged in a stone enclosure and dated to around 6,000 years ago, proving that the ritual management of marine mammals was not a recent adaptation, but an ancient institution backed by spiritual authority. The logical cascade of this maritime civilization includes navigational techniques that used swell patterns, bird flight paths, and a star compass divided into sectors that precisely matched the seasonal winds. Knowledge that was transmitted through the Malu song cycles, still performed today. The material proof was documented by anthropologist Alfred Haddon in his 1898 expedition and has been updated by the University of Cambridge's Torres Strait Archaeological Project, which used satellite imagery to map the fish weirs across the entire strait, revealing over 400 stone traps, some more than 200 meters long, designed to channel fish into holding pens at low tide. The existential punch is that the Torres Strait Islanders invented aquaculture, open sea navigation, and sustainable marine management thousands of years before the civilizations of the Mediterranean. Yet their story is relegated to a footnote in world history because they did not build stone cities. That same erasure cloaks the oldest engineered structures on the continent, which lie not on land, but beneath the waters of the Bass Strait, in a drowned landscape that was once a fertile plain connecting Tasmania to the mainland. 12,000 years ago, the sea level was 60 meters lower, and a land bridge called the Bashian Plain stretched from Wilson's Promontory to northern Tasmania, a lush expanse of lakes, grasslands, and eucalyptus woodlands larger than the United Kingdom. On this plain, the ancestors of the Tasmanian Palawa people hunted, camped, and left behind stone tools that have now been recovered by underwater archaeologists in a discovery that redefines the very concept of a prehistoric civilization. The declaration of scale is that the drowned sites of the Bass Strait represent the largest known maritime archaeological landscape on Earth, covering over 100,000 square kilometers, and the stone tools recovered from the seafloor off the coast of Victoria include anvils, hammerstones, and grinding slabs that prove the plain was not a transit route, but a permanently occupied homeland. The status quo of Australian archaeology long assumed that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people became isolated on their island after the sea level rise, and that their culture underwent a simplification, a myth that was used to justify colonial dispossession. The quantified catalyst arrived in 2018, when a team led by David Collin of the University of Tasmania used multi-beam sonar to map the submerged topography, and then deployed a remotely operated vehicle to retrieve a curated assemblage of stone tools from a depth of 25 meters at a site called Cape Portland. Tools that have been deliberately cached in a way that implies the owners intended to return. The logical cascade of the drowning of the Bashan Plain is not just an environmental event. It is a cultural catastrophe that severed a civilization in half, separating the Tasmanian people from the continental kinship networks for over 10,000 years. Yet the oral traditions of both sides preserved the memory of the land bridge in stories about a time when the sea was a grassy plain that could be walked across. The material proof lies in the geochemical fingerprinting of the underwater tools, which match the quarries in the Otway Ranges, and in the genetic evidence that Tasmanian Aboriginal people were completely isolated from mainland populations after 12,000 years ago, a date that matches the marine inundation models. The reflection that surfaces here is that the Aboriginal civilization of Australia is not just the oldest continuous culture on Earth. It is a culture that survived a catastrophic sea level rise that would have destroyed entire nations elsewhere, and it did so by adapting, remembering, and maintaining its identity across an impassable strait. That resilience was built on a spiritual framework that was itself a form of civilization, a legal and ethical system inscribed not on paper, but on the land itself, through the songlines. The songlines, known as the Dreaming Tracks, are a network of oral maps that cross the Australian continent. Each one a multi-chapter epic that encodes the location of waterholes, the boundaries of clan estates, the migration routes of animals, and the appropriate ceremonies to maintain the fertility of the land. The declaration of scale is that the major songs, such as the one that follows the Seven Sisters, from the south coast to the central desert, can span over 3,000 kilometers, traversing the territories of 30 distinct language groups. And the entire corpus of songlines constitutes a library of ecological and legal knowledge that has been memorized and passed down orally for at least 40,000 years. The status quo of world literature places the origin of epic poetry with Homer and the Mahabharata. But the songlines predate these by tens of thousands of years and contain a level of geographic precision that can be cross-referenced with modern satellite imagery. The quantified catalyst emerged from a collaboration between Aboriginal elders and geographers at the Australian National University, who overlaid the recorded songlines onto a map of waterholes and found that every named site on the songline corresponded to a real water source, and that the narrative descriptions of the terrain, including long-vanished lakes and now desert rivers, matched the landscape as it existed during the last ice age. The logical cascade is mind-altering. If the songlines have accurately preserved the geography of a continent from 40,000 years ago, then the human memory, when structured through ritual and performance, is capable of storing information across geological timescales, making the oral tradition not myth, but an encyclopedic database. The material proof is demonstrated by the fact that several archaeological sites, including the Clogs Cave in the Buchan region of Victoria, were relocated by archaeologists, following directions provided in a local songline. Directions that led them to a deposit of stone tools and animal bones, radiocarbon dated to 23,000 years, exactly where the story said the old people had camped. The publication of this work in the journal Antiquity in 2020 has revolutionized the way science views oral tradition. But the popular imagination still equates written records with historical truth and oral records with fable. The existential revelation is that the Aboriginal civilization built its library inside the human mind, using the landscape as a mnemonic device, and that library is still partially intact today, a living database of deep time that we are only just learning how to query. And if the songlines are the memory, then the largest gathering site on the continent, a complex of stone houses and fish traps in the southwest of Victoria, is the physical signature of the society that used that memory to thrive in an unpredictable environment. And that site deserves the #1 spot on this list because it forces a redefinition of civilization itself, 6,600 years ago. As the Mesopotamians were beginning to build the first mud brick temples, the Gunditj Mara people of Lake Condah were constructing a settlement of stone houses, water channels, and eel traps that would eventually support a permanent population of several thousand people. The declaration of scale for Buj Bim, which I opened this countdown with, is its legal and engineering achievement. Over 146 stone dwellings, each with internal hearths and stone furniture, arranged in villages that were interconnected by a hydraulic system of canals, weirs, and holding ponds designed to trap the annual migration of short-finned eels. The status quo of history taught that the Gunditj Mara were nomadic, that they moved with the seasons and built no permanent structures. But this was a colonial fiction designed to render the land legally empty. The quantified catalyst is the excavation led by Heather Bilth in the 2000s, which revealed that the eel traps were not natural lava tubes but deliberately modified channels with stone walls, built to a consistent width of 60 centimeters, angled to funnel eels into basket traps at specific water velocities. Carbon dating of the earthen embankments return dates of 6,600 years before present, making Buj Bim one of the oldest known aquaculture systems in the world, contemporary with the earliest floodplain irrigation in China. The logical cascade of the Buj Bim civilization is that it was a society with enough food surplus to support specialized trades, stonecutters, weavers, trap makers, and elders who managed the water flow through communal labor. The evidence of feasting, of eels, smoked and stored in bark containers, of trade in the basalt axes from the nearby Mount Eccles quarry, all point to a complex economy that matches the definition of a civilization in every way except writing. The material proof was definitively recognized in 2019 when Buj Bim was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and the management plan now includes Gunditj Mara rangers, who are restoring the traditional hydrology to bring the eels back. The existential impact of Buj Bim is that it forces us to confront the lie at the heart of the Australian historical narrative, that the continent was a wilderness, that its people were primitive, and that civilization arrived with the British. The stone houses of Lake Condah are not ruins, They are an argument, an enduring challenge to the global definition of civilization that excluded a continent simply because its people did not need to build empires to live in balance with their world. And as the water flows back into the ancient channels, the eels return to the traps. Not because the past is dead, but because it has been waiting for us to catch up.